Joan Kennedy said it in 1978 on the cover of People magazine, in plain language that should have stopped the world. She had been sober for 1 year. She had moved out of the Kennedy world, into her own apartment in Boston, studying for a master's degree, making decisions that were entirely, finally hers. And when asked what had changed, she said, "It was hard for Ted at first because I used to say yes, dear, to everything, and now I can say no." Millions of people read that sentence. And then the interview moved on, to the campaign, to the children, to whether Joan Kennedy would be appearing on the trail when Ted ran for president. Nobody stopped. Nobody asked, how many years was that going on? What did it cost you, every time? And what happened to you, to your career, to your music, to the person you were before, during all those years of yes? She told them, in plain language, on a magazine cover with her name on it. They didn't hear her. The newspapers in November 1958 called Joan Bennett a catch. That word, catch, appeared in multiple accounts of her wedding to Edward Moore Kennedy. She was 22, blonde, patrician, a graduate of Manhattanville College, where she had studied classical piano seriously and modeled in print campaigns with the ease of someone who didn't particularly need the money. She didn't need to. That was part of the story. What the papers did not mention, she had grown nervous about the engagement. She hadn't known Ted Kennedy long. The courtship was fast, compressed by the family's schedule, by the sense that a Kennedy did not linger. When she hesitated, Joseph Kennedy Sr. made clear the wedding would proceed. She walked down the aisle in a dress she loved, into a life she hadn't chosen at the pace she would have chosen it. The photographs from that day are striking. The word the press used was radiant, and for once the word fit. She looks, in those photographs, like someone standing at the beginning of something she believes in. And the piano, the instrument at the center of her life since childhood, the thing she had spent years learning to do at a level most people never reach, went unmentioned in every account of the ceremony. That small erasure was a rehearsal for everything that followed. What the public saw of Joan Kennedy in the early years was precisely what it was meant to see. Joan Kennedy at a Senate dinner. Joan Kennedy on the campaign trail. Joan Kennedy at the Kennedy compound, where the family moved in a permanent state of competitive noise, touch football, loud opinions, everyone arriving and departing with the certainty that the world was organized around them. She had a role in that world, and the role had specific requirements: visible, beautiful, present, uncomplaining, and, most essentially, quiet. She kept the requirements. She attended the events. She smiled with the practiced ease of someone who has learned to hold a position for a long time without showing the effort. In Moscow, on an official Senate visit, Ted Kennedy brought Joan into rooms with heads of state. He told Leonid Brezhnev about her musical accomplishments. He gestured to her with pride, as you would gesture to something you owned that you were pleased to own. "Of course," she said later, recounting it, "he didn't let me ask questions." Of course. She used those words without bitterness, as though it required no explanation, as though the arrangement was simply, you may be in the room, but the room belongs to someone else. The magazines called her one of the most glamorous wives in Washington. The photographs agreed. What the photographs don't catch, what photographs never catch, is the distance between a woman's face and her interior. After Dallas, Jackie Kennedy gave the press a word: Camelot. She placed it deliberately, and it transformed everything it touched. What had been a political family became a myth. And myths require their supporting cast: beautiful young wives, shining children, the appearance of grace under every pressure. Joan Kennedy fit the image. Blonde to Jackie's dark, softer where Jackie was precise. But both were women who understood, had been trained to understand, that a wife did not contradict the story being told about her in public. The hardest thing, Joan said not long after the wedding, is learning to keep up with the clan. The Kennedys had their own atmosphere, loud, physical, competitive, always in motion, always with an opinion about what you should be doing and how. Joan had been raised quietly, in a Bronxville household where the texture of private life was not constantly tested in public. There had always been music, a certain interior privacy. The Kennedys had no structural room for either. She kept up. For years, she kept up. And when she couldn't, when the miscarriages came, 3 of them across those years, absorbed in silence because you did not discuss those things, moved past because the Kennedy world moved past everything, even her grief was reported only in political context. The third miscarriage, in September 1969, was noted by the press because it came 6 weeks after Chappaquiddick. Even loss inside that marriage had a news cycle. Before anything else, this needs to be said clearly. Joan Bennett was a pianist. Not in the way that well-raised women of her class sometimes played, as accomplishment, as something graceful to mention. She had studied seriously at Manhattanville. She practiced the way musicians practice, slowly, repetitively, attending to small passages for hours, building precision in the hands and a kind of listening intelligence that does not exist outside of sustained, disciplined work. In 1970, 1 year after Chappaquiddick, months after her third miscarriage, inside a marriage already fracturing at its foundations, she performed a piano recital with the Philadelphia Orchestra. She received standing ovations. The reviews were stellar. Music critics do not use that phrase as a courtesy. She went on to perform internationally, in concert halls across 3 continents, under conductors including Arthur Fiedler, Seiji Ozawa, and John Williams. She narrated Prokofiev's Peter and the Wolf with the Boston Pops. She built real friendships inside the classical music world, the world she actually inhabited, the one that was genuinely hers. None of this was incidental. This was a career. Serious, documented, critically acclaimed, and conducted almost entirely in the margins of her life as a Kennedy wife, in the spaces between campaign appearances and Senate functions and family catastrophes, as though music were something she was permitted only after the real obligations were met. Bobby Kennedy, in 1968, invited her to play on his presidential campaign trail. She remembered it in an interview 24 years later, softly, with a specificity that tells you she had held it carefully all that time. He took me with him and encouraged me. He had a theme, "This land is your land." I'd play that on the piano and everybody would come in, feeling really great about everything. Then, it seems like a long time ago. But it's part of my memories. Bobby was shot that June. The man who had said, "Come with me, your music matters," gone. And the career that had been, briefly, allowed to be public contracted again into the private room where Joan had always been required to keep it. By 1962, 4 years into the marriage, something had shifted that would not shift back. Ted Kennedy later described noticing it that year, in language that reveals more than he likely intended. He walked into a room before a campaign event and found his wife unsteady. He said it was the first time she hadn't been able to make it. He described it, decades later in a recorded interview, as a difficult thing to cope with and deal with. He described what he observed. He did not describe what had produced it. What had happened in those 4 years. She had promised to be ready to go anywhere and accommodate herself to his schedule, and she had. She had attended the events and held the smile and been present in rooms where she couldn't speak. She had absorbed 2 miscarriages in silence. She had watched a family of almost incomprehensible public consequence organize itself entirely around its men, and understood, without needing it explained, that her role was to make that look beautiful. A close friend from her college years said it to People magazine in 1974. Plainly. In print, Joan's too good for the kind of role life gave her. She simply was not brought up to cope with what she's been asked to cope with. She has always been very fragile, and no one's ever understood that. Her flashy good looks are ironic. She's basically a sweet, shy person. Fragile. That word followed Joan Kennedy for 20 years. It appeared in magazine profiles and television commentary and the private assessments of people who knew her. It was meant with sympathy, but it misidentified the thing. Joan Kennedy was not fragile. She was a woman performing, at concert hall level, in a role that had no room for who she was. You do not walk onto a Philadelphia orchestra stage fragile. You walk onto that stage having done the work. What she was placed somewhere that could not hold her, and watched, by the press, by the family, by the public, as the gap between who she was and what was required of her grew into something neither she nor anyone else could bridge. I want to stop here, before we go any further into what this marriage did to Joan Kennedy's career, and say something directly. The word that keeps appearing in everything written about her is fragile. And I understand why people reached for it. There is something in her photographs, even in the ones where she's smiling, that reads as a certain kind of exposed. But I think what was actually visible in her face, in the ones where you look carefully, is not fragility. It's the specific expression of someone working very hard to make something feel natural that is not natural at all. Every woman watching this knows that expression. We've worn it. We've seen it in the mirror and put on one layer more of whatever was required and gone back out into the room. The question is not why Joan Kennedy couldn't sustain it. The question is how long she did. July 18, 1969. Joan Kennedy was pregnant, her fourth pregnancy, after 2 miscarriages. She was confined to bed rest. She was at home. Her husband was on Chappaquiddick Island at a party. Sometime after midnight, he drove off a narrow bridge into Poucha Pond. He got out. Mary Jo Copchin, 28 years old, did not. He did not report the accident for 10 hours. Joan found out the next morning. Pregnant, on bed rest, she dressed and appeared at Mary Jo Copchin's funeral. She stood beside Ted at his court appearance, where he pled guilty to leaving the scene of an accident. She stood in front of the cameras. 6 weeks later, she miscarried for the 3rd time. She told the author Lawrence Lemur what happened inside her after that. Not metaphorically. Literally. For a few months everyone had to put on this show. And then I just didn't care anymore. I just saw no future. That's when I truly became an alcoholic. She said it without drama. The way a person states something after they have had enough time and distance to understand exactly what it was. She understood exactly what it was. In 1978, when the separation was 18 months old and Joan was beginning, carefully, to become legible to herself again, she told People magazine what it had been like. I didn't know why I was drinking too much. At times, I drank to feel less inhibited, to relax at parties. Other times I drank to block out unhappiness, to drown my sorrows. Both things. Sometimes in the same evening, alcohol to enter the room, and then alcohol to survive having been in it. She said Ted's affairs went to the core of my self-esteem. Not her heart, her self-esteem, the thing that tells you whether you have a right to exist as you are, to take up space, to believe that your own experience is real and worth attention. She had been trying to get into Alcoholics Anonymous. She had begged, according to author Lawrence Lemur, who documented the Kennedy family in detail. She was in genuine need, and she knew it, and she was asking for help. Ted Kennedy would not allow it. He feared, specifically, structurally, as a political calculation, what it would mean if his wife's alcoholism became publicly known. The family had already spent years managing the secret. So instead of AA, he arranged for a priest who was also a psychiatrist. A priest, so the seal of confession and confidentiality would be absolute. A psychiatrist, so the help appeared to be happening. Joan described what those sessions actually were. I talked to him. And all I do is wait until he left and go into my closet and get a bottle of vodka. She waited until he left. Then she got the only thing that was actually available to her. Through all of it, the miscarriages, the affairs that were Washington's open secret, the Chappaquiddick aftermath, the priest psychiatrist, the years of performing loyalty in public, she kept the music. She stood in front of the Philadelphia Orchestra in 1970. Standing ovations. Stellar reviews. This was the year after everything. She performed internationally. She played under Ozawa Fiedler Williams. She built a real life inside the classical music world, the world that asked nothing of her except the quality of her attention and the intelligence of her hands, the world where she was not Mrs. Kennedy, not the senator's wife, not the woman who needed to be managed. She was Joan Bennett, a musician, a serious one. Music was not compensation. It was not a coping mechanism. It was the evidence of who she had been before the marriage required her to become someone else, and the proof that person had not been entirely extinguished. She said it herself, 2 decades after the divorce, in an interview about the book on classical music she had written and published. Music has given me a lot of courage to carry on. Not joy, not pleasure, courage. The specific word for the thing you need when continuing is hard. If you're finding Joan Kennedy's story worth sitting with, the music career, the silence it was kept in, what the Kennedy marriage cost her, please subscribe. What we do here is take the time to stay close to a woman's interior life until we can actually see it. That's not a common thing. That's exactly why we do it. January 1980. Ted Kennedy was running for president against Jimmy Carter, trying to survive the Iowa caucuses. 2 new investigative articles had just appeared about Chappaquiddick, questioning his account of what had happened that night. At a press conference, the first question was directed at Joan. Did she believe her husband's story? The Washington Post correspondent present described what happened next. She walked to the microphone. She paused. And then, in a shaking voice, she said, "Yes, I believe my husband's story, which he told me right after the incident." She continued, something about the timing, about how the stories were coming out now because of the Iowa caucuses, about how it was a shame that it all had to come out again. Then she walked back to her seat. The press corps, which had come prepared with questions about the Olympics, about policy, about the campaign, went silent. For a full minute, nobody said anything. Then everyone walked away. The press conference ended. "I wanted to ask Kennedy about the Olympics," one network correspondent said afterward. "But you just couldn't do it after that." What made the room go silent was not the content of her statement. It was her visible emotion, the shaking voice, the effort it took her to speak at all. The press read it as devotion, as loyalty so profound it was almost painful to witness. What it was, a woman at a microphone, in front of cameras, publicly defending the event that had cost her a pregnancy, accelerated her addiction, and, by her own testimony, marked the moment she stopped seeing a future. Saying, "I believe him." Her husband, as she walked back to her seat, murmured a single word. "Good." She knew what the marriage had cost her. She said so clearly enough, in enough places, that clarity was not the problem. To People magazine, 1978, "I tried to be like the Kennedys, bouncy and running all over the place. But I could never be that. That's not me. I'd rather take long walks, sit by the fire, or play the piano." That sentence is not a complaint. It is a self-portrait. She knew who she was. She was describing the distance between that person and the person she had spent 20 years being asked to perform. She described Ted as a superdad, exuberant, a Pied Piper. She described herself as quiet, good for times when the kids like to cuddle up and just visit and talk. She was drawing a portrait of incompatibility without rancor, 2 people, genuinely different, in an arrangement that could only cost one of them. When she told Jackie Kennedy about the decision to divorce, Jackie said she should have done it 15 years earlier. Said she wished she'd given that advice sooner. Maybe Joan wouldn't have gotten so sick. Joan's response, recounting the conversation, "But back then, 15 years ago, I probably wouldn't have been able to take her advice." That sentence does not blame Jackie. It describes what had happened to her own capacity, how the years had dismantled her ability to recognize what she needed, and how slowly and at what cost she had rebuilt it. The marriage had not just taken her music career. It had taken, for a long time, her ability to know what was hers to want. The divorce was finalized in 1982. The addiction continued. 4 DUI arrests across the following years. Rehabilitation stays. Sobriety, then relapse, then sobriety again, the particular shape of a disease that does not resolve just because you have named it. In her worst period, in the early 2000s, the substance she was hiding was vanilla extract and mouthwash, chosen because they contained enough alcohol and didn't smell like liquor. Her children noticed. The caretakers they'd hired noticed. She was 68 years old and finding ways around the people trying to help her. In 2005, she was found on a Boston street near her Beacon Street apartment. Concussion, broken shoulder, blood alcohol well above the legal limit. Her children obtained legal guardianship. Ted Jr. became her guardian. It was reported in most outlets as the latest chapter in a sad story. The fragile wife. Still. But here is what is also true. In the sober years between the collapses, she was teaching children classical music, performing at benefit concerts, attending lectures, writing, working toward the master's degree she had wanted for decades. Every time she came back to the things that were actually hers. It's such a relief to be free, she said in a 2000 interview about her sobriety. 4 months later, she was arrested again. The disease is not interested in insight. But she kept returning anyway. That is the fact of her that matters, not the falls, which were documented exhaustively. The returning. In her later years, Joan Kennedy performed publicly, taught, worked with children's charities, attended concerts, played. She published a book in 1992, The Joy of Classical Music, A Guide for You and Your Family. In the interviews she gave about it, she talked about music the way someone talks about the thing that kept them alive. Plainly, without drama, with the matter-of-fact certainty of lived experience. Music has given me a lot of courage to carry on. She chose not to remarry. She had one brief relationship after the divorce, and then she chose to be alone. Her apartment in Boston. Her piano. The water when she went to the Cape. Long walks, fires, the specific quality of quiet that she had known since before the Kennedy world imposed its noise on her. She chose to attend Ted Kennedy's funeral in 2009. She tried, her sister said, not to intrude. She was simply there to say goodbye to someone she had been married to for 25 years. She sat with a family she had entered at 22, that she had tried to become, that had cost her more than any of the eulogies that week would say. And she chose, across the late 1970s and 1980s, in decades when women did not do this, to speak honestly about what had happened to her. Not bitterly, not publicly in a way that indicted anyone. But plainly, with her name attached. I didn't know why I was drinking too much, she said. And later, when she did know, she said that too. Some of them heard. Joan Bennett Kennedy died peacefully in her sleep on October 8, 2025. 89 years old. The cause of death, dementia. Her alcoholism, the records noted, was in remission. In remission. At the end. Her last public appearance was at the Kennedy family's 4th of July gathering, 3 months before she died. She attended, still part of the family she had married into at 22, still present at the table she had never entirely left, despite everything the table had cost her. Her son Patrick called her a talented musician and instrumental partner to his father's career. Her son Ted Jr. said he would always admire her for facing her challenges with grace, courage, humility, and honesty. The story that usually gets told about Joan Kennedy is the story of proximity to disaster, the Kennedy disasters, the national tragedies, and her own. The beautiful blonde wife who couldn't hold up. The Camelot casualty. The one who broke. Here is the other story, the truer one, and the quieter one. A woman with a genuine, serious, critically acclaimed musical career entered a marriage that had no structural room for that career except as ornament. She tried to be what was required. She said yes, dear, for 20 years. She lost pregnancies and stood at funerals and stood at press conferences with her voice shaking. She was denied the help she asked for because asking for it would have been politically inconvenient. She broke under the weight of all of it. And then she came back. Imperfectly. Incompletely. With enormous cost. She came back to the piano, to the concerts, to the children she taught music to the book she wrote about why music matters when everything else fails. She said once, remembering Bobby Kennedy and the campaign trail, what it had felt like to play. Everybody would come in, feeling really great about everything. That was her gift. Not beauty, not bloodline, not the ability to stand beside power and appear content. Music. The specific thing she could do that made people, for a moment, believe something was possible. She played to the end, quietly, without the career she might have had if the life had been different, without the audience she had earned. She played anyway. That is what she carried. That is what she kept. If you recognized something in Joan Kennedy's story, in the music kept in the margins, in the years of yes, in the long return to herself, please share this with someone who might need to see it. Every woman's interior life deserves this kind of attention. That's what we're here for.